Hi, welcome to another lecture in the Leadership of the Army in Northern Virginia series, which the BGES conducted in October of 1996 at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. Previous lectures have set up the two great Southern armies and have compared and contrasted and introduced you to the two great leaders of the Army of Northern Virginia, Joseph E. Johnston and Robert E. Lee. What makes the Army of Northern Virginia special is their subordinate leadership, and we made a determination to deal with the Corps leadership at the appropriate levels, and the most senior individual in the Army of Northern Virginia at the Corps level leadership was James Longstreet. Longstreet has several biographies written about him, and our next speaker, Dr. Bill Piston from Southwest Missouri State University in Springfield, was the most recent biographer of James Longstreet, and there would be others. For example, Jeff Wirt would write one on Longstreet, Lee's controversial general, but Longstreet engendered a great deal of controversy, and he perhaps embodied all of the contradictions that were present in the manner in which Southern armies were led and which Northern armies eventually would be led. Southern armies were, especially in the East, were generationally led. They were people who had cut their military bona fides back around the same time that Jefferson Davis was a cadet at West Point, and Davis thought a great deal of West Point graduates, and so consequently there was a whole series of contemporaries of Jefferson Davis's who filled the four-star ranks. Conversely, Longstreet came from a generation about 10 to 12 years behind Lee and Albert Sidney Johnston and Joseph E. Johnston and so forth. And consequently, those people achieved high leadership positions in the Confederate forces, but they didn't achieve the top ranks. Some were going to receive the opportunity, such as John Bell Hood, when attrition began to weed out the other four-star generals that Davis had selected throughout the course of the war. James Longstreet should have been a four-star general by most rationales, but he never achieved the rank. He was never given command of never given a four-star command, despite having some opportunities to audition under independent command. He frequently sought to come out from under the thumb of Robert E. Lee, and he considered Joe Johnston to be his mentor, to be his sponsor in the armies. And so Longstreet does become controversial. And it was with ease that we asked Bill Piston to make his way from the small airport in Springfield to the smaller airport in Roanoke, with all the connections that went into that. But it was important that we had somebody of real substance who understood the essence of James Longstreet and could present all that to us. There is so much I could say about Longstreet, but you're not here to hear me. You're here to hear Bill Piston. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Bill Piston's presentation of James Longstreet, Lee's controversial general.
For those of you who went to the reception last night, we had a breakdown of communication there. We had a breakdown today. We had laid on original Corps best sewer trout for lunch today. We were sure we were going to give you a meal that the cadets have grown to love and respect over the years. It's probably been the best source of business for the Southern Inn downtown that you could ever find. We called the place the Club Crozet, and it was not offered with any degree of affection intended whatsoever. Then we went upstairs, and already we're bearing the effects of women. I see that we now have tablecloths on the table, and the cadets are learning some of the finer arts. So the Corps is really going downhill rapidly.
We ladies in the 40s had tablecloths.
Oh, yeah, it is. A real fascinating element that we would like to talk about this afternoon, and I want you to think about this as we go through these couple of talks this afternoon. Robert E. Lee is a graduate of West Point, class of 27, 28. He's 50 some odd years old at the time of the war. As is Joseph E. Johnston, Jefferson Davis. Just in those days, as we do today, we consider perhaps a great deal of the wisdom and the growth of our society to be once you enter those middle years, that is where you begin to have your maximum influence on society, your maximum involvement in what is going to happen within the grouping. That's an important thing to keep in mind, because what we're going to talk about this afternoon is we're going to talk about corps commanders. We're going to talk about people, excuse me. The staff is our, that's right. Already, Jubal Early is at work. But the important thing to keep in mind about these men this afternoon is we're talking about men that are 38 and 39 and 40 years old. We're talking about a new generation. We're talking about the 1840s. We're talking about people that have a different degree of influence and have been influenced in a different way than the Robert E. Lees and the Joe Johnstons of the Civil War. It is a new generation. But these are the men who will strike. These are the men who have been tasked to fight the battles of the Army in Northern Virginia. No more so, no more impressive a men than James Longstreet and Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson. And that's the source of this afternoon's talk. A couple of years ago, Gary Gallagher at a talk had made a comment, and he had the task of talking about James Longstreet at the Battle of Second Manassas. And a point that he made in there, which stayed with me for 6, 7, 8 years now, was he was talking about, he was trying to put James Longstreet, his position in the Army, in context, and he said, there is a new dissertation coming out. A man by the name of Bill Piston is writing his dissertation, and he had read it, and he said, this will give you a new perspective on James Longstreet. He says, I commend it to you. Keep an eye out for it. Well, I read Bill Piston's exposition of James Longstreet, and for my money, with respect to Jeff Wirt, Bill Piston has the most insightful and detailed analysis you will find of James Longstreet. So it was very easy to ask him to come and make this presentation this afternoon. Bill is a graduate of help me, Vanderbilt University, and has now taken on a faculty position at Southwest Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri. In addition to his writings on Longstreet, he has now become a leading scholar in Missouri history and is working on research and books on the Battle of Wilson's Creek. So I look for him to make equally measurable contributions in the Western historiography, which is now beginning to get much more attention. So it's with a great deal of pleasure, and I ask you to please join me in welcoming Bill Piston.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking Lynn very much, very publicly, for the opportunity to address all of you here this afternoon. I actually have 3 specific reasons why I'm very happy to have an opportunity to address you. The first one is, well, I have students who ask me sometimes, what's the point in studying history? I mean, it's not like there's anything I'm going to learn from your class in military history of the Civil War that will be immediately applicable to me in my daily life. Well, thanks to this seminar's events, I can give them now a solid example. Because during our first morning break, as I dashed outside after having had several cups of coffee, like so many of you, I perceived a long line out there of men standing in line. And I said, well, this resembles a siege. And under the circumstances and my pressing needs, Siege tactics are not appropriate. This will lead to catastrophic failure. So I instantly remembered the emphasis that Archer Jones had placed on the importance of the turning movement in military history in his The Art of War in the Western World. So I dashed down the steps looking for another strategic geographic point to seize, only to find that those good military historians Richard McMurray and Gordon Ray had preceded me with the precise same conclusion. So there is a direct lesson to be learned here. Second, with all due respect to Dr. Rowland, I would like to suggest to you that our analysis of Longstreet might be based on something more than the post-war memoirs of men who hated Longstreet for his Republican politics, such as Richard Taylor, whose military service, despite what he wrote in his post-war memoirs, never placed him in a position to analyze the relative military skills of James Longstreet and Robert E. Lee. Finally, I'm happy to have an opportunity to speak to you because we are in Lexington. For it was in this fair city, with its proud history, its long association with so much that is good and noble and admirable about America, about the South, and about Virginia, that a great crime was committed against a man who deserves to be remembered as one of our foremost military heroes. For only a few hundred yards from where we are standing right now, in 1872 and 1873, at Washington and Lee University, in speeches commemorating the birthday of Robert E. Lee, former Confederates Jubal Anderson Early and William Nelson Pendleton launched the first assaults in a long campaign to assassinate the character and perjure the military record of James Longstreet. Historian Thomas L. Conley has chronicled the rise of the Lee cult, which Early and Pendleton established, exploring their cynical and selfish manipulation of Lee's memory in his 1977 work, The Marble Man, Robert E. Lee and His Image in American History. Inspired by Conley's work, a decade later I produced Lee's tarnished lieutenant, James Longstreet, and his place in Southern history. In this, I trace the workings of a group within the Lee cult, which I labeled the anti-Longstreet faction, noting how their hatred of Longstreet for his Republican Party affiliation following the Civil War led them to make Longstreet a scapegoat for Lee's failures during the Gettysburg campaigns. I also described how, in response to these attacks, Longstreet eventually became his own worst enemy. Stung by abuses heaped upon him for his political convictions, and outraged by the lies concocted by the anti-Longstreet faction, Lee's old Warhorse lashed out with almost blind fury. Lowering himself to the level of his critics, Longstreet cast aspersions on their records and made grossly exaggerated claims in regard to his own leadership during the war. Longstreet not only lost the literary battle which was fought out from the 1870s through the turn of the century in memoirs and articles in newspapers and magazines, he also helped to confuse the historical record. The struggle exposed embarrassing weaknesses in Longstreet's character, which later historians wrongly assumed were lifelong traits. Thus, the falsehoods spread by Jubal Early and his followers were accepted as historical truth by 20th century scholars, including Douglas Southall Freeman, who failed to adequately consider the element of bias when selecting sources to portray Longstreet to their readers. Because this conference takes as its theme leadership in the Army of Northern Virginia, I will not detail here at length the story of Longstreet's place in Southern history, although we may get into that in the question and answer period. Instead, I want to focus on the reasons why I consider Old Pete to have been one of the South's greatest assets during the war. Because I think Longstreet has been frequently underrated, I choose to accentuate the positive. This does not mean that I consider his career to have been error-free. Longstreet made severe mistakes at Seven Pines, and perhaps worse still, he attempted to blame his failings on others. Although innocent of the well-known post-war charges leveled against him in relation to Gettysburg, Longstreet was guilty of neglecting reconnaissance and the proper positioning of Pickett's division on that battlefield. In Tennessee in 1863, he was embarrassingly outgeneraled at Lookout Mountain and botched the assault on Fort Saunders at Knoxville. Moreover, Longstreet's subsequent handling of discontent among his subordinates rightly leads historians to raise questions about his fitness for independent command. I am convinced, however, that an objective analysis of Longstreet's wartime record, an analysis freed from the post-war myths about Longstreet, that he was by nature slow, stubborn, egotistical, or inordinately ambitious, reveals a professional soldier who did remarkably well for the Southern cause. Our examination of Longstreet might begin by noting that Marie's Heights was a very unpleasant place to be. That, at least, was the conclusion of young William B. Pettit, an artillerist forced to endure the Federal bombardment on December 13, 1862, during the Great Battle of Fredericksburg. Perhaps to take his mind off the physical danger, Pettit paid particular attention to the presence near his battery of a certain high-ranking Confederate officer. 3 days later, he recalled in a letter to his wife, Lieutenant General Longstreet wore a gray military coat and pants, the coat with remarkably short skirts and tail. It was a frock coat, of course, and did not reach the middle of his thighs. No marks of insignia or rank were visible. His hat was plain black felt with a rather narrow brim and a high crown. A plain sword hung at his side. He is about 6 feet 2 inches high, of strong round frame, portly and fleshy, but not too corpulent or fat. His dark hair is auburn, and his long whiskers and beard are the same color, and thick and heavy. His forehead is broad and full, and his brows heavy. His nose rather straight and fleshy, and his eyes, which set in close to his nose, are dark and steady in their movements and gaze. Pettit clearly liked what he had seen in the commander of the First Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, for he closed with this observation. Longstreet was almost always walking to and fro, apparently thinking. He had a very intellectual appearance, is certainly a very industrious man, and an energetic, skillful officer. Next to Lee, I should prefer entrusting the chief command of our armies to him. Now, Pettit's image of James Longstreet as intellectual and energetic by nature contrasts sharply with the popular view of the man Robert E. Lee called my old warhorse. If challenged to describe Longstreet, many Civil War buffs would conjure up an image of him as burly and gruff, sullen, slow in both thought and movement. That image, however, is a product of the great Gettysburg controversy, which continues to obscure Longstreet's contributions to the Southern War effort. The elements which made Longstreet one of the most commendable leaders of the South, or indeed American history, are complex. The sum is greater than the individual parts, however, for at bottom one confronts the almost indefinable things that constitute human nature. Longstreet's leadership consisted of many elements, 5 of which I want to consider here. There was first his ability to inspire his men. Second, the sagacity and celerity of his operations. Third, his recognition of the power of the defensive. Fourth, his ability to command and control men amid the chaos of war. And fifth, his formulation of cogent, sophisticated strategies for winning the war. Longstreet learned the methods and benefits of inspirational leadership in the hard and dangerous school of experience. Although he did not excel academically at West Point, from which he graduated in 1842, Longstreet thoroughly mastered all the physical aspects of soldiering. His natural leadership emerged on the playing field, for by his own admission, he enjoyed sports and frolics, as he called them, more than book learning. Phenomenally strong, he was a superb horseman and swordsman, and a crack shot with a pistol or a rifle. He loved hunting and fishing and any vigorous outdoor activity. These traits, which originated in his boyhood tramps through the woods and fields of the back country of Georgia that was his home, were honed to perfection in adulthood. They made him, by 19th century standards, a man's man, highly physical, self-reliant, self-confident, and honest. As a lieutenant commanding a company in the 8th Infantry during the Mexican War, Longstreet led men from the front, as was expected of him. In 1846, serving under General Zachary Taylor in northern Mexico, he participated in the battles of Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Monterrey. In the last 2, the 8th engaged in vicious hand-to-hand fighting and suffered particularly high casualties among its officers. As a result of his valor and skill, Longstreet was named regimental adjutant. He refused, however, to let this position keep him out of combat the following year, when his regiment was transferred to those forces of General Winfield Scott during the campaign to capture Mexico City. Longstreet voluntarily carried the regimental flag at the battles of Churubusco, El Molino del Rey, and Chapultepec, where he was grievously wounded the day before the Mexican capital fell. Such conspicuous gallantry, as the dispatches put it, won him promotion to brevet major. Following the Mexican War, Longstreet served almost exclusively upon the frontier, usually in Texas or New Mexico, although he participated in several expeditions against Indians, one of which was under his own independent command. Elusiveness remained the primary characteristic of his foes. Apparently, Longstreet never fired a hostile shot at any Native American. Longstreet was a major in the Paymaster's Department when the war between the states began in April of 1861. After resigning his commission, he went to Richmond, initially with the hope of forming a regiment of mounted infantry from among the many Texans who were flocking to Richmond in search of a fight. President Jefferson Davis, however, commissioned him a brigadier general and assigned him to a brigade of Virginians. As part of General PGT's Beauregard forces guarding the rail junction near Manassas, Longstreet's men on July 18th defended Blackburn's Ford of Bull Run against the advanced elements of General Irwin McDowell's approaching Federal Army. This was Longstreet's first test as a field grade officer, and he passed it admirably by combining astute troop dispositions with personal leadership. When at one point his outnumbered brigade seemed to waver, Longstreet leaped forward. His aide-de-camp, Captain Thomas J. Goree, recalled how Longstreet, amid a perfect shower of balls, rode amongst them with his cigar in his mouth, encouraging and inspiring confidence in them. The Confederate line held, and the Federals retreated. Brigadier General Jubal Anderson Early, who became Longstreet's bitterest post-war enemy, identified Longstreet's inspirational leadership as the source of the victory. "I am satisfied," wrote Early in his after-action report, "that Longstreet contributed very largely to the repulse of the enemy by his own personal exertions." During the first 2 years of the war, Longstreet won consistent praise from his superiors who recognized the value and quality of his leadership. Both Beauregard and General Joseph E. Johnston sought to have him designated officially as second in command, but the presence of higher-ranking officers prevented this. Longstreet was even more highly valued by Lee, who assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia during the summer of 1862. Lee praised Longstreet as a capital soldier and described him as the staff in my right hand. Following the 7 days campaign, Lee had all officers who outranked Longstreet transferred from the Army and withdrew troops from Stonewall Jackson's wing of the Army to increase the size of Longstreet's command. Longstreet, not Jackson, was Lee's premier subordinate. Longstreet contributed handsomely to the Confederate victories at 2nd Manassas and at Fredericksburg, while his firm resolution helped to save the Army at Sharpsburg during Lee's disastrous Maryland campaign. Longstreet's success was firmly rooted in the high regard in which the common soldiers held him. This was by no means limited to men who served in his own First Corps. During the winter of 1863, R.A. Shackelford, a soldier under Jackson, wrote home to his loved ones the following: "Longstreet is a bully general. He is a real bulldog fighter, and he drives the Yankees wherever he meets them. He's a favorite of mine. I think he is next to General Lee. General Lee calls him his old Warhorse." In October of that same year, a young Texan named John West observed, "Longstreet is a bulldog soldier and can whip any army on earth if he has enough men to fight with until he gets tired." Arthur Fremantle, a British soldier visiting Lee's army during the invasion of Pennsylvania, remarked on the special relationship between Longstreet and his men. After noting the nickname Bulldog, Fremantle wrote in his diary that, "By the soldiers, Longstreet is invariably spoken of as the best fighter in the whole army." As the Confederates converged upon Gettysburg on July 1st, Longstreet rode forward, passing through the columns of men belonging to the commands of Generals Richard S. Ewell and A.P. Hill. In his diary, Fremantle recorded the reaction of the famous Stonewall Brigade after Lee's stalwart lieutenant passed by. As they have nearly always been on detached duty, few of them knew General Longstreet, except by reputation. Numbers of them asked me whether the general in front might be Longstreet, and when I answered in the affirmative, many would run on 100 yards in order to take a good look at him. This I take to be an immense compliment from any soldier on a long march. Later that same afternoon, Fremantle recorded a similar incident. After passing Johnson's division, we came up to a Florida brigade, which is now in Hill's Corps. But as it had formerly served under Longstreet, the men knew him well. Some of them, after the general had passed, called out to their comrades, "Look out for work now, boys, for here's the old bulldog again." Longstreet was equally inspiring in battle. Gettysburg again provides examples. On the second day, he led General William Barksdale's men against the peach orchard, riding well ahead of their charging line, waving his hat instead of a sword. A Federal general captured during the action remarked ruefully, "Our generals don't do that sort of thing." Longstreet's reluctance to order the assault, which became famous as Pickett's Charge, is well known. But few people are aware of the way in which he deliberately shared his men's danger during the fierce Federal counter-bombardment which preceded it. There was little cover for the lines of infantrymen waiting to advance, and having to take the enemy's punishment without being able to return the damage was psychologically distressing to the extreme for foot soldiers. Brigadier General James L. Kemper remembered afterwards, "Longstreet rode slowly and alone, immediately in front of our entire line. He sat his charger with a magnificent grace and composure I never before beheld. His bearing was to me the grandest moral spectacle of the war. I expected to see him fall every instant. Still he moved on, slowly and majestically, with an inspiring confidence, composure, self-possession, and repressed power in every movement and look that fascinated me." In the fall of 1863, Longstreet was sent west with 2 divisions and attached artillery. He arrived in northern Georgia in the middle of the Battle of Chickamauga, and the attack he launched on September 20th drove half the Federal Army from the field. General Braxton Bragg's hard-fighting soldiers of the Army of Tennessee gave him a new nickname in honor of this first major victory in the West. They called him the Bull of the Woods. After service in East Tennessee, Longstreet and his men departed for Virginia in the spring of 1864. Lee's staff officer, Walter H. Taylor, likened the return of the First Corps to a military sacrament. Longstreet was severely wounded, however, during the Battle of the Wilderness. He was sorely missed during the subsequent campaign. When he returned in October, the Virginia Army was pinned down at Petersburg. Yet when Longstreet made his first inspection tour, his men went wild with excitement, leaping up defiantly on the breastworks and cheering him as he rode past. And if we follow the logic from Dr. Rowland's quotation, this is firm evidence that Longstreet's men considered him to be nothing less than a god. Cheer your soldiers, cheer you, you're a god. Longstreet did more than inspire his men. He won the respect of them because he possessed qualities which contributed to the Army's victories. He learned things rapidly, and he applied his knowledge rapidly. One of the most ridiculous myths of the Civil War holds that Longstreet was slow by nature, and therefore slow in his operations, particularly when hard marching was involved. Nothing could be further from the truth. Longstreet's first experience with maneuvering large numbers of troops came in 1862, when Johnston shifted his army to confront General George B. McClellan on the peninsula. Because he needed to be in Richmond at the conference, Johnston delegated the advance force to Longstreet. As historian Donald B. Sanger notes, it became Longstreet's job to disengage some 7,500 men from his lines and to get them moving. Column after column had to clear the defensive area without crossing each other and without exposing any part of the front to successful surprise attack. Longstreet's redisposition of the troops received the full approval of Johnston's staff. That Longstreet handled the task well is not surprising. He had the requisite training and driving temperament for such work. But that he assumed easily and with so little confusion the office of second in command speaks well for his reputation among his fellows and the confidence that they had in him. Longstreet enjoyed an excellent relationship with Johnston throughout their service together. On the peninsula, Longstreet commanded the rearguard action known as the Battle of Williamsburg. Johnston noted in his report that General Longstreet's clear head and brave heart left me no apology for interference. After the war, Johnston recalled that he had been particularly impressed by Longstreet's promptness of thought and action and his ability in difficult situations to reach correct solutions expressed with such quickness as to be termed by some intuition. As Longstreet gained experience, he became a master of making rapid movements without disorder and with minimal straggling. Confederate artillerist E.P. Alexander remarked that Longstreet could maneuver 30,000 men on a battlefield with the coherence and speed with which other men maneuvered companies of 100. During the Second Manassas Campaign, his troops covered over 30 miles in just 24 hours. In the maneuvering which led to the Battle of the Wilderness, his men covered 43 miles in 36 hours. The term foot cavalry was just as appropriate for Longstreet's First Corps as it was for Jackson's Second Corps. Nor was Longstreet slow on the second day at Gettysburg. He began his advance with Lee's consent at 11 a.m. and attacked at 4 p.m. Since he moved only some 6 to 8 miles, this might not appear to be rapid, but one must consider the conditions of the battlefield. True, Longstreet made mistakes and had to backtrack, thereby losing time. But the actual pace of the march, between 2 and 3 miles an hour, was quite normal for men moving across fields and along country lanes. The head of Longstreet's column was in position between 2 and 3 p.m. But armchair analysts who merely consult maps and never walk the ground forget that 2 divisions of soldiers occupy 7 miles of roadway. Even on a wide thoroughfare, they might take almost 2 hours to pass any given point. Since Longstreet, like any other commander, wanted to use all his men in the assault, he attacked only after the last man at the end of the column had arrived and deployed for battle. Thus, 4 p.m. was not late at all. True, speed did not characterize Longstreet's operations during the Knoxville campaign. But in terms of the physical pace with which his men moved, this was not Longstreet's fault. His divisions had been sent west by the Confederate War Department without wagons, horses, or mules necessary for offensive operations. This forced Longstreet to conduct his campaign with equipment grudgingly supplied by Braxton Bragg, and crippling shortages combined with the rugged terrain to reduce the speed of his movements drastically. Longstreet is more properly vulnerable to a charge of mental lethargy at Knoxville. But there is no more reason to portray this one period of failure as the defining moment of his personality and career than there is to judge Stonewall Jackson exclusively by his miserable performance in the 7 Days campaign. Longstreet not only maneuvered quickly throughout the majority of his career, he commanded wisely. He carefully calculated risks against both the costs in men's lives and the significance of the prize to be gained. When detached from Lee temporarily in the spring of 1863, he conducted operations against Suffolk, Virginia, and New Bern and Washington, North Carolina. But he refused to wreck his divisions attacking heavily entrenched positions to regain towns of minimal military significance. The Federal subsequent abandonment of Suffolk after Longstreet's withdrawal certainly testifies to Longstreet's wisdom. Longstreet's main assignment was to collect food for Lee's nearly starving army, and that is what he did. There was no glory in it, but he refused to throw away his men's lives simply to increase his reputation. The heat of battle never clouded Longstreet's judgment, not even in the most desperate situations when Confederate fortunes were poised on a razor's edge. At Sharpsburg, when Lee's lines were stretched to the breaking point, a subordinate pleaded with Longstreet for artillery support. Longstreet replied in a firm note which read, "I'm sending you the guns, dear General. This is a hard fight, and we had all better die than lose it." In an era before radio communications, the circumstances encountered on a battlefield did not always allow subordinates the luxury of consulting with their superiors before making important moves and reaching important decisions. At Second Manassas, Longstreet did not shirk at the exercising of the responsibility entrusted to him. Seeing the Federals' vulnerable position, Longstreet launched a counterattack, anticipating by minutes orders from Lee to do precisely that. Significantly, Lee rewarded Longstreet's initiative. With the bloodbath summer of 1862 wane, Lee submitted the names of James Longstreet and Thomas Jackson to Davis for promotion to lieutenant general. Lee expressed reservations about raising Jackson to high rank, but endorsed Longstreet enthusiastically and without qualification. Longstreet, not Jackson, was Lee's intimate friend, valued confidant, and most talented subordinate. Longstreet struck some of the hardest blows in American military history in 2nd Manassas, Gettysburg, Chickamauga, and the Wilderness. But he also knew when not to advance. When Lee considered attacking with Longstreet's newly arrived troops late on the first day of battle at 2nd Manassas, Lee was proposing, as historian Donald B. Sanger notes, nothing less than a piecemeal attack on an unknown force over unknown ground. As intelligence reports indicated, falsely as it turned out, that federal troops might be advancing towards the Confederate flank, Longstreet counseled delay. Lee considered and agreed. When Longstreet attacked the following day, he forced General John Pope to display a portion of his anatomy which he had bragged the Southerners would never see. Longstreet also disliked Lee's decision to continue fighting in Gettysburg after the first day's victory. He urged Lee to maneuver between the Federals and Washington, forcing them to do the costly attacking. Longstreet also objected strenuously to Pickett's charge. Lee, of course, made up his own mind, and we can only speculate concerning alternative results of the battle. Longstreet's qualms regarding Lee's offensive tactics were based on his keen appreciation of the power of the defensive. Civil War soldiers went off to war believing that courage made a difference on the battlefield. The problem, as historian Gwen Dyer notes, is that the bullets didn't care. The introduction of rifles tripled the range of small arms fire and increased correspondingly the number of casualties an attacker could expect to incur reaching his objective. Some soldiers learned to adapt to these changed circumstances quicker than others. Historian Larry Addington writes that by 1870 in Europe, Prussian doctrine was revised to emphasize the avoidance of frontal attacks where possible, while seeking to turn the enemy's flanks instead. The object of the new doctrine was to use strategic maneuver to confront an enemy and then employ the tactical defensive in order to allow firepower to destroy the enemy. This formula ensured a swift, crushing defeat on Napoleon III in the Franco-Prussian War. Longstreet reached the same conclusion independently and much earlier. Perhaps as early as Blackburn's Ford, when he saw his men, deployed in a heavy skirmish line, defend disadvantageous terrain against a numerically superior foe. By the time of Fredericksburg, he was convinced that given the South's limited resources, the tactical defensive should be used whenever it was practical, combined if possible with field fortifications. Here too, Longstreet was innovative. He was the first Confederate commander to employ traverse trenches to protect his men from enfilade fire, and at Jackson's request, he taught the Second Corps engineers how to construct them. Historian Sanger, himself an Army officer, contends that the fortifications Longstreet constructed along the Rappahannock line before and after Fredericksburg were the beginning of the complicated modern systems of field fortifications in depth. Sanger notes, if James Longstreet had contributed nothing else to the science of war, this alone should place him on the list of those whom posterity honors. This did not mean, however, that Longstreet was in any sense a passive soldier. He believed in maneuvering aggressively, including invading enemy territory in order to obtain advantageous positions. He was entirely enthusiastic, for example, about invading Pennsylvania in 1863, as he believed it would offer the Confederates an opportunity to get between the Federals and key positions such as Washington, forcing them to do the costly attacking. Longstreet's preference for the tactical defensive under advantageous conditions may even have had its origins in the Mexican War experience, where, unlike Lee, Longstreet actually led attacks and fought hand-to-hand. When Longstreet asked his men to charge, he knew exactly what they would encounter. It is not surprising to learn that as a civilian after Appomattox, Longstreet followed the developments of the Franco-Prussian War through American newspaper accounts, marking the positions of the contending forces on maps with colored pens, as the Prussian victory seemed to confirm the conclusions Longstreet had reached concerning the conduct of war. Longstreet should also be considered a modern soldier. Historian Richard L. DiNardo emphasizes that in his forthcoming study of Longstreet's staff, which was perhaps the most talented, most smoothly functioning organization of its type north or south. Longstreet staff handled all the functions necessary to run a corps. Officers had duties in relation to commissary, quartermaster, ordnance, and other concerns, as all staffs do. Longstreet differed from other generals, however, by using the inner circle of his staff as his alter ego. They not only collected information for him, they acted on the battlefield with his authority, giving orders in his name based on their assessment of the conditions they found at any given point. Longstreet briefed his staff thoroughly on his plans and then trusted them to implement them. In an era when battlefields might stretch for miles, such a delegation of authority actually allowed Longstreet to impose his will on a huge body of men dispersed over a large area more tightly than some other commanders did. This system proved its worth time and time again, but two instances stand out. When Longstreet reached Bragg's headquarters at Chickamauga at 11 p.m. on the night of September 19, 1863, the Confederates had already endured a full day of grueling battle. Bragg placed Longstreet in command of the left wing of the Army of Tennessee, gave him a sketchy map showing the approximate positions of his troops, told him to attack the next morning, and then went back to bed. A lesser man might have despaired, but Longstreet took control with confidence and celerity. With great labor, he and his staff straightened out the Confederate line, as much as humanly possible, which had become thoroughly tangled up by the course of the battle. Longstreet then drove Rosecrans from the field, showing no mercy on the man who had been his West Point roommate. In May 1864, Lee positioned Longstreet to the west of his main forces, and when Grant advanced through the wilderness, Longstreet descended upon the Federals with awesome power. At a crucial point in the confused combat, Longstreet formulated an impromptu division of 4 brigades and placed it under the command of his chief of staff, Moxley Sorrell, with instructions to hit the Federal flank. Sorrell did so with such effectiveness that he was soon promoted to brigadier general and given a regular line command. Those who failed to respect Longstreet's staff faced his wrath. Following Chickamauga, Longstreet dispatched a division of Lafayette and McLaws to pursue the retreating Federals. Some 2 miles from Chattanooga, McLaws found the enemy crossing a pontoon bridge. Thomas Walton and Francis Dawson of Longstreet's staff were present, and both urged him to attack at once in accordance with Longstreet's desires. McLaws, however, refused. Dawson recalled, "When we reached General Longstreet that night and told him what General McLaws said, he responded angrily with a reference to a place a lot hotter than Chattanooga." Longstreet obviously selected his staff with great care. He had no place for banjo players or clergymen around his campfire, but sought out men of talent wherever he found them, regardless of their previous experience. He met Goree, for instance, a young Texas schoolteacher, while traveling to Richmond at the beginning of the war. Goree's private letters, which have been published by the University of Virginia Press under the editorship of Tom Cottrell, paint an intimate portrait of Longstreet as a commander. Goree described Longstreet as one of the kindest, best-hearted men I've ever known. Good work was always rewarded with praise, and Longstreet's reports were consistently filled with commendations and recommendations for promotion from his staff officers who displayed merit. There was no illiberality about him, Sorrell recalled, and the officers knew it, and they tried for his attention. Service on Longstreet's staff was physically exhausting. For Longstreet's remarkable energy, he once told a comrade he literally never felt fatigue in his life, played a major part in the South's successful campaigns. Indeed, for a man in his early 40s, his physique was awesome. Able to go incredible lengths of time without food or sleep, he sometimes forgot the limitations of his staff officers. After the staff went to sleep, it was not unusual for Longstreet to pace restlessly beneath the stars, mulling over some military problem. Once daylight made observations possible, Longstreet would be off, leaving his embarrassed staff to break camp hurriedly, their hopes of breakfast dashed by their chief's driving will. It would be impossible to exaggerate the affection which existed between Longstreet and his staff. Their reaction to Longstreet's accidental wounding in the Wilderness was recorded by Robert Stiles, a young artilleryman who chanced upon them as they moved the general to the rear. Stiles wrote, "I never on any occasion during the 4 years of war saw a group of officers and gentlemen more deeply distressed. They were literally bowed down with grief. All of them were in tears. One, by whose side I rode for some distance, was himself severely hurt, but he made no allusion to his wound, and I do not believe he felt it. It was not alone the general they admired who had been shot down. It was rather the man they loved." Thanks in part to this efficient staff, Longstreet found time to concern himself with more than just events in his own narrow sphere. Longstreet was an early and influential member of that informal association of Confederate officers and politicians that historians Thomas L. Conley and Archel Jones have labeled the Western Concentration Bloc. The group, which included Beauregard, Johnston, and Texas Senator Louis T. Wigfall, was united in the belief that the Confederacy's greatest peril lay west of the Appalachians, and that a greater portion of the government's scarce resources must be devoted there, even at the risk of losing Virginia. Given the Union advances that by the fall of 1862 included victories at Forts Henry and Donelson and at Shiloh, the capture of most of Middle Tennessee and Kentucky, and the capture of almost all of the Mississippi River region except Vicksburg, such concern was understandable. Longstreet first expressed an interest in serving west of the Appalachians in a private letter to Johnston on October 6, 1862. Johnston was then recovering from the wounds he had received at the Battle of Seven Pines. On this and other occasions when he discussed going west, Longstreet was apparently motivated in part by ambition, including promotion and the possibility of independent command. The list of famous successful commanders in military history who are not ambitious is a short one indeed. And there is nothing to suggest that Longstreet's ambition was unusual, either in its degree or in its impact on his career. Longstreet made detailed strategic proposals to the War Department on 2 occasions. There was nothing unusual about this. In fact, almost every high-ranking officer sent unsolicited suggestions either to President Davis or Secretary of War James A. Seton at one time or another. Longstreet made his initial strategic proposal in May of 1863 while he was in Richmond, just after completing his assignment in southwestern Virginia. When he met with Seton, the Secretary was actually the first to mention the crisis in the West, where General John C. Pemberton was trapped by Ulysses S. Grant at Vicksburg. Seton suggested that Longstreet, with part of Lee's forces, unite with the troops of Johnston in Mississippi in order to recover the citadel on the river. Longstreet endorsed this concept, but offered a more workable alternative. Part or all of his First Corps, together with Johnston's troops, would join with Bragg's men at Tullahoma, Tennessee. The then much enlarged Army of Tennessee would first defeat Rosecrans, then move against Grant's communications, saving Vicksburg by compelling him to retire. Seton liked the idea, but when Longstreet took up the plan with Lee, Lee balked at decreasing the number of troops defending his native Virginia. It should be noted that had Longstreet's plan been adopted, he would have gone from being second in command to Lee to a position below both Johnston and Bragg, indicating that his strategic vision was sincere and not a screen for self-advancement. Longstreet's second proposal was actually an entire set of suggestions. Following Chickamauga, Longstreet was detached from Bragg for a campaign against Knoxville. This failed, as we all know, and Longstreet spent the winter and following spring in East Tennessee as an independent commander. Bragg, meanwhile, was defeated at Missionary Ridge, and Johnston replaced him. In a letter to Davis on May 16, 1864, Longstreet outlined 3 distinct plans. He later met with Lee and Davis at Richmond to discuss them in detail, a measure of the seriousness with which the government treated Longstreet's strategic views. Longstreet's first plan called for mounting his divisions in East Tennessee in order to launch a massive raid across the mountains into Kentucky. In retrospect, this seems impractical, to say the least, impractical to the point of whimsy. Yet both Lee and Davis gave it strong consideration. Longstreet's second plan envisioned his returning with his men to Johnston in Georgia. Once reinforced by troops from the Atlantic coastal defenses under Beauregard, they would advance to recoup their losses in Tennessee. Longstreet reserved his greatest enthusiasm, however, for a scheme which he considered to be the strongest and most effective one the South could make. Under this plan, Beauregard and his men would join Longstreet in Abingdon, Virginia. Then they would cross through the mountains into Kentucky, not as raiders, but as an army of liberation. This would force the Federals in Tennessee to retreat, Johnston would follow, and with good fortune, the two Confederate forces would unite somewhere in the Bluegrass region. Longstreet's schemes would have been difficult to execute, to say the least, for he apparently underestimated the acute logistical problems implementing them would have involved. Nevertheless, Bragg had penetrated deep into Kentucky in 1862, and what could be accomplished once might be done again. Much more significant, however, is the fact that unlike his proposal in May of 1863, and unlike the proposals reaching Davis and Seddon from other generals, the set of plans Longstreet put forward in 1864 did not target federal soldiers, rail connections, or cities. Instead, they were designed to prevent the re-election of Abraham Lincoln. Longstreet said, "We should go into Kentucky as a political move. If we retain our present positions, the enemy will, in the course of a few months, be able to raise large additional forces. And when entirely ready, he will again concentrate his forces at some point and will eventually get possession of them. And he will continue to proceed in the same way to the close of the chapter. If we go into Kentucky, the enemy will be more or less demoralized and disheartened by the great loss of territory which he will sustain." The political opponents of Mr. Lincoln can furnish no reason at this late day against the war, so long as it is successful with him. And thus far, it has certainly been as successful as anyone could reasonably expect. If, however, Lincoln's opponents were to find at the end of 3 years, we held Kentucky and were as well to do at the beginning of the war, it would be a powerful argument against Lincoln and against the war. Lincoln's re-election seems to depend on the results of our efforts during the present year. If he is re-elected, the war must continue, and I see no way of defeating his re-election except by military success. Davis, of course, ultimately rejected Longstreet's proposals. While the implementation of Longstreet's plans might not have saved the Confederacy, the South did indeed go down to slow defeat precisely as Longstreet had predicted. The West was not reinforced, and the North's capture of Atlanta in September of '64 assured Lincoln's re-election. The American experience in Vietnam has demonstrated the naivete of Napoleon's maxim that God is on the side of the biggest battalions. In hindsight, Longstreet's targeting of civilian morale in the North, rather than the Federal Army, appears to be prescient. Longstreet's strategic vision was clearly one of the most important elements of his Confederate leadership. It is worth noting again that his schemes would have reduced, not enlarged, his own command role, as he would have lost his independent command. Longstreet, however, always placed his beloved South above any other personal considerations. When combined, the elements I have discussed made Longstreet one of the foremost soldiers of the war. At the corps level, he had no equal, and he outshone many who attained higher rank and position than he did. Yet even today, it is not fully appreciated, as Longstreet remains the victim of both bias and a double standard, particularly in works by historians such as Robert Crick, Judah Pallett, Stephen Woodworth, and Emory Thomas. By double standard, I mean simply that actions and characteristics which would be interpreted in a positive light are in Longstreet's case interpreted negatively. The problem goes back to Reconstruction and continues to the present. Longstreet fought for a cause in which he believed, sacrificing his fortune, welfare, and health, but when defeated, he preached compromise and reconciliation with his enemies. In other men, such as Robert E. Lee, this is character and nobility, but Longstreet was labeled a traitor. As a soldier, Longstreet sought every way possible to defeat his enemies, and he corresponded with those both higher and lower in rank than himself in an attempt to prosecute the war more effectively. In others, this is called drive and initiative, but in Longstreet's case alone, it is labeled presumption and interference. Longstreet possessed a healthy ego, one neither larger nor smaller than those of his contemporaries. In Patrick Cleburne and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, this is called self-confidence. But in Longstreet, it has been labeled not merely egotism, but corrupting self-promotion. Longstreet's wartime correspondence testifies to his complete confidence and faith in Longstreet. During the war, it was Lee's frequent habit to ride with Longstreet, camp near him, and discuss military matters with him thoroughly. In the case of any man other than Longstreet, historians would from this evidence conclude that Lee sought Longstreet's company because he liked Longstreet and valued his advice. But in Longstreet's case, historians ranging from Douglas Southall Freeman to Emory Thomas assert perversely that Lee stuck close to Longstreet because he did not trust him. What then can we conclude about the leadership Longstreet brought to the Army of Northern Virginia, an army in which he served longer than any other higher-ranking officer, including Lee? James Longstreet did not routinely have a high portion of his command strung out as stragglers. He informed his subordinates thoroughly rather than keeping his plans obsessively secret. He did not habitually arrest his subordinates, suck on lemons, or attribute the outcome of battle to divine providence. He did not cater to banjo players or newspaper correspondents. He never wore feathers, and he drank whiskey rather than lemonade. In short, Longstreet was a professional, not an eccentric, a hypochondriac, or a fop. But like Omar Bradley in World War II, Longstreet's very lack of flamboyance or idiosyncrasies are one reason why his contributions have not attracted as much respect as they deserve. The phrases the common soldiers used to describe him sum it up best. Longstreet was the old bulldog, the bull of the woods, and above all else, the best fighter in the whole army. Thank you.
Questions, please?
Yes, sir.
Yes, in his memoirs, I understand that he said quite a few detrimental things about Jackson.
About whom?
About Jackson, and his,
Oh, yes.
particularly in his role in the 7 days, Mechanicsville and Auburn Hill and so forth. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Longstreet wrote a lot of crap. In the stuff. I mean, it's terribly embarrassing, and I believe that the great fault of historians is not being able to separate the prose that Longstreet churned out in the post-war period, the overwhelming majority of which is utterly undependable, from his actual wartime career before the controversy. And he wrote some terribly embarrassing things about Jackson. His jealousy was just came through so strongly. At one point in his memoirs, he made an absolutely absurd charge that Jackson had left the battlefield at Sharpsburg, quote, for refreshments, unquote. Longstreet really was his own worst enemy. It was very easy for historians in the 20th century who'd been raised to hate Longstreet by the Lee cult, just as they'd been raised to accept racial segregation, to look back and read Longstreet's own stuff and think, yeah, of course this guy fought the war in a fit of consuming jealousy. Look at what he wrote after the war. But if you separate that and look at his wartime record, I think you get a very different picture. Not of a perfect man, not perfect at all, not of a man without ambition, but a man who, just as much as other famous generals, is not motivated exclusively by ambition, and as his record shows, could make plenty of suggestions that would have lowered rather than raised his role in the war. So yes, jealousy of Lee and Jackson is in the articles he wrote for the Century magazine. It's in the stuff he wrote for the Philadelphia Weekly Times, which got republished as Annals of the Civil War. But I think you just have to take that into context. There's nothing to suggest before this controversy starts that that sort of jealousy would have been characteristic of Longstreet. Other comments? Yes, Jack.
Is there sufficient contemporary evidence to assess what the Longstreet-Jackson relationship was, if there was a relationship between them?
The contemporary evidence I have found is that there isn't a relationship. There is professional cordiality, but nothing beyond that. And I have not found, for that matter, I mean, even if you go to the post-war period, nothing to suggest that Jackson and Longstreet ever sought each other out to spend time together for anything other than purely professional reasons. So I don't think Longstreet staff or Jackson staff members got the record wrong when they left the impression that these two men didn't have anything other than a professional relationship. I think there's a record of Jackson telling one joke at Longstreet's expense that got remembered because Jackson didn't usually joke like that. He referred to the Washington artillery as Longstreet's bodyguard. And it was remembered, I forget whose memoirs this is in, because, usually they didn't joke. And for Jackson to make, kind of a subtle witticism, sort of like, well, Longstreet, here comes your bodyguard, is unusual because they don't have a relationship with those sort of witticisms, which, I apologize for not having anything bad to say about Jack Davis. Everyone seems to want to start. I have nothing at all bad to say about Jack Davis, so you see, because we don't have a close relationship, so I can't kid him like that. So I literally think that's the parallel, that there's not much of a relationship. Yes, in the back, and then I'll work over.
What influence did his wife have on protecting his reputation?
Which wife?
20th century, Helen.
She did, but it appears to me that by the time they were married, that's the 1890s, he had completed his memoirs, and while he was at work on a book on the Mexican War, what's left of the manuscript is frankly rather dull and doesn't appear to be pompous or anything like that. So she had a lot to do with trying to preserve his memory after he was dead, but in terms of influencing what actually got into print, I can't see that either wife had any influence whatsoever. We don't know if his first wife, Louise, read anything that he wrote while she was alive before he sent it out. Don't know that. Whether or not he read to her, got her advice, or consulted his sons, just don't have those details. Yes?
Yeah, Bill, you mentioned that Longstreet encouraged a Western reinforcement not out of personal ambition, but out of genuine strategic consideration. But once he got to the West with his two divisions in the fall of 1863 and took a good long look at Braxton Bragg, he became involved in what later became characterized as a cabal. Would you spend a few minutes talking about the role he played in
he certainly did. He certainly did, and it is very much to his discredit. But what is often forgotten, the only thing you get is here's Longstreet, who doesn't like Bragg, who saw an opportunity perhaps to replace Bragg, true, who had ambition, true, but who could still write letters that came up with schemes that would reduce his command, to be placed back under Johnston or Beauregard or both. So while he did indeed join the anti-Bragg faction, become the leader of it, and that is not to his credit, to undermine the authority of his commanding officer is completely inexcusable. That is not the only way in which we should look at Longstreet in the West. And I believe that he was capable, as most human beings are, of being both ambitious and on occasion pulling back and genuinely offering advice that was for the best of the war effort. So that episode represents the nadir of his career, and there's nothing creditable about it. We can only say what we've said about everybody there is the list of people who couldn't get along with Braxton Bragg is so long it included Bragg himself. But you're quite right. As I said here, I wanted to accentuate the positive, partly because this is the geographic place where his career was so maligned. I tried to focus on what I thought were his good points, but it is very, very much not to his credit that he apparently did almost nothing to cooperate with Bragg. Yes?
Didn't he write a letter, though, to Davis at that period in time that urged Davis to send Lee out to the West and take control of the armies and straighten things out?
Now, how do you judge that? Judith Halleck argues in her Braxton Bragg and the Confederate Defeat. First of all, by the way, she does cite a letter in which Lee writes that it was with the expectation that Longstreet would take command of the army that he approved of Longstreet's idea of going west. And she cites the letter. Lee indeed did say that. She claims that means that Lee entered in a conspiracy with Longstreet to remove Braxton Bragg. The question came up earlier here today, did anyone anticipate Longstreet taking Bragg's place? Well, apparently when the idea was first discussed, that was Lee's understanding of it. In any case, once you get out there, the situation is just very different. And again, the relationships fall apart completely. I'm not quite sure. Did that go back to what you were saying? And let me.
That Longstreet had asked Davis to send Lee.
Yeah. Okay. And the debate is among people like myself and Halleck and others, was that sincere? Some people have just dismissed that and say, well, he absolutely knew Davis would never come out and let Lee leave, or Lee would never leave. And Halleck writes, for instance, that Longstreet says he proposed Johnston to replace Bragg rather than himself. Well, if Longstreet ever did that, surely it was self-serving, knowing that Davis would never do that. Well, I'm afraid the evidence is that Davis did eventually swallow his qualms and accept Joe Johnston. So I'm not quite so willing to say that Longstreet's proposal that Lee come west is based on a previous assumption that A, Lee will never do it, Davis will never consent to it, and Longstreet must have been just, blowing smoke and really wanting the job himself. Why can't the same man who comes up with schemes to place himself below Johnston and Beauregard in an effort to defeat Lincoln's reelection, why can't that same man envision Lee coming west? If he comes up with proposals to try and win the war that lessens his own role, why can't he be sincere? So we do know that he did suggest Lee come west. Read your historian and take your choice as to how sincere Longstreet's request was. I think it was probably sincere. I think he genuinely did have a concern for strategy that went beyond his ambition. Being a human being, the two were mixed up, entwined. Yes?
Did Lee ever make comment about Longstreet after Gettysburg? Lee himself make action reports or whatever?
After action reports, no. Lee's account of the Battle of Gettysburg, the actual battle itself, as opposed to the maneuvers up to it, that report takes up all of 6 pages. And after all the books written on the Battle of Gettysburg, we have precisely 6 pages of Robert E. Lee telling what he did and why at Gettysburg. That's it. That's part of the problem. And of those 6 pages, 2 of them are early letters to Davis that are so bizarre in their misinformation that unless they were printed in with the reports of Gettysburg, you'd never guess what battle Lee was talking about. Because what he said he did and what happened is just plain